Let me start with something I see all the time. Someone walks up to a tree, looks up into the canopy, notices a little deadwood, maybe a lean, maybe a cavity, and they say, yeah, that tree looks risky. But under ANSI A300 Part 9, that is not a tree risk assessment. That's just looking at a tree. A professional tree risk assessment is a structured, methodical process where we evaluate three specific components: the likelihood of failure, the likelihood of impacting the target, and the consequences of failure. And those three elements taken together are what determine risk. Not the presence of a crack, not decay by itself, and not just a lean. So what I want to do in this podcast is walk you through how a real assessment unfolds in the field and how visual assessment, tree architecture, defects, indicators, and even advanced assessment all fit together under the ANSI A300 Part 9 framework and ISA TRAQ methodology. Everything starts with visual assessment. Whether you're performing a level 1 limited visual assessment from a drive-by perspective, a level 2 basic assessment where you're on site and walking around the tree, or you're considering whether a level 3 advanced assessment is justified, the foundation is always disciplined observation. But disciplined observation is not just scanning for obvious problems, it's understanding how the tree is built and how it carries load. That's where tree architecture becomes critical. When I approach a tree, I'm not immediately hunting for cavities or cracks. I'm looking at the overall architecture. I'm evaluating taper in the trunk. I'm noticing whether there's sweep or bow in the stem and whether that curvature is part of normal development or a response to past loading. I'm looking at the live crown ratio and asking whether the crown is proportionate to the stem diameter and root support. I'm observing whether there's a wide root flare that transitions smoothly into buttress roots, which typically indicates good structural development, or whether there's a lack of root flare that suggests planting depth issues or stem girdling roots. All of that informs how loads move through the tree, because ultimately tree risk assessment is about load paths. Wind load enters the crown, transfers through branch attachments into the trunk, and then down into the root plate. If that load path is disrupted anywhere, at the branch union along the stem or within the roots, then the likelihood of failure may increase. Let's start at the root system, because root failures are often catastrophic and frequently misunderstood. When I evaluate the root plate, I'm looking for both defects and indicators. A defect is a structural weakness, something that directly compromises strength. Dead or missing roots are a defect. Stem girdling roots that compress vascular tissue and alter structural development are a defect. Fire-damaged roots can be a defect if structural tissue has been compromised. But then we have potential indicators, and this is where professional judgment matters. If I see soil mounding on one side of the trunk, that may be a potential indicator of root plate movement. If I see termite nests or frass near the base, that suggests biological activity, but it does not automatically confirm structural compromise. If I observe dead or loose bark at the buttress, that may indicate underlying decay, but I still need to interpret context. Fruiting bodies, depending on species and location, are often definite indicators of decay. Oozing from the root collar may suggest infection or canker development. Fused roots can alter load distribution. A lack of root flare may signal planting issues, while a well-developed wide root flare often correlates with good buttress strength. Each of these observations feeds into the likelihood of failure, but none of them alone determines risk. Now let's move up the trunk. Leans get a lot of attention, but a lean by itself is not necessarily a defect. Trees naturally lean in response to light, competition, or site conditions. What matters is whether that lean is recent, whether it is accompanied by soil displacement, and whether there is evidence of a corrected lean, meaning the tree has produced reaction growth to compensate for previous movement. If I see a crack, I'm immediately asking what type of crack it is. A transverse crack that runs across the grain can indicate significant structural compromise. A shear plane crack suggests separation along a predictable failure line. A seam may represent an old crack that has occluded over time. Freeze-thaw cracks and frost cracks may form due to rapid temperature fluctuation, and their structural significance depends on depth and extent. Bulges, ribs, and ridges often represent response growth around defects. A cavity may be visible, but the critical question is not whether there is a hole, it's how much sound wood remains in the load path. Sapwood decay can significantly reduce bending strength even when the exterior appears intact. Fruiting bodies along the stem are often definite indicators of internal decay. Cankers disrupt cambial continuity and may weaken localized areas. Then we evaluate the crown. Crown structure dramatically influences loading. A reduced live crown ratio may indicate stress or limited energy reserves. Crown dieback can signal root dysfunction or vascular disruption. Codominant stems with included bark represent a classic structural defect because the bark inclusion prevents proper wood fiber interlocking. When you see multiple branches originating at one point, that creates stress concentration zones. An overextended branch increases lever arm forces and therefore bending stress at the attachment. Adventitious branches and epicormic shoots may indicate stress response, loss of apical dominance, or previous topping. Deadwood increases the likelihood of branch failure. Sudden branch drop can occur even in the absence of obvious decay, particularly in large mature trees under heat stress. As I assess these features, I'm constantly thinking about how loads are transferred and where stress concentrations may exist. But here's where we need to pause and remember something critical. The presence of a defect does not equal risk. Risk only exists when there is a target. Under A300 Part 9, we must evaluate the likelihood of failure, the likelihood of impacting the target, and the consequences of failure. If a tree with significant decay stands in an area with no occupancy and no valuable targets, the overall risk rating may be low. Conversely, a moderate defect over a playground, sidewalk, or structure may result in higher risk due to increased consequences and occupancy. So we identify the tree part, we identify the target, we estimate likelihood of failure based on defects and indicators, we estimate likelihood of impacting the target based on occupancy and distribution, and we evaluate consequences based on size and potential damage. Those components are then integrated using the risk rating matrix to determine overall risk categorization. That is what separates inspection from assessment. Inspection identifies conditions, assessment interprets conditions within a structured risk framework. Now let's talk about Level 3 Advanced Assessment. Advanced assessment is not something we do casually. It is justified when visual assessment identifies conditions that cannot be adequately evaluated through observation alone, and when additional information would influence management decisions. If I observe fruiting bodies at the base of a large tree in a high occupancy area, and I cannot reasonably estimate residual wall thickness, advanced tools such as resistance drilling or sonic tomography may be appropriate. If I suspect dead or missing roots below grade, root excavation may be justified. If there's a large cavity with uncertain structural integrity within a primary load path, additional diagnostic methods may be necessary. But a reasonable and prudent arborist does not use advanced tools to replace judgment. We use them to refine it when the decision threshold demands it. And finally, documentation. Every professional tree risk assessment must clearly document the tree part, the targets, observed defects, potential indicators, definite indicators, site factors, likelihood ratings, consequence ratings, overall risk categorization, and recommended mitigation. Mitigation might include pruning to reduce load on an overextended branch, removing deadwood, installing supplemental support in codominant stems, improving soil conditions, or in some cases, removal when risk cannot be reduced to an acceptable level. Tree risk assessment is not about being alarmist. It is about being systematic. It is about reading tree architecture, understanding load paths, distinguishing between defects and indicators, recognizing when advanced assessment is justified, and making defensible decisions grounded in ANSI A300 Part 9. So the next time you approach a tree, slow down. Don't just look for cavities or cracks. Read the taper, study the root flare, notice the sweep and the lean. Identify whether you are seeing a defect, a potential indicator, or a definite indicator. Consider the target, integrate likelihood and consequence, and document your conclusions as a reasonable and prudent arborist. Because professional tree risk assessment is not about spotting problems, it is about structured judgment, informed, disciplined, and defensible. Thanks for listening to the Arborist-podcast. Let's keep building your arborist knowledge one domain at a time. If you found this useful, please like and subscribe.